Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's conversation with Erin Parsons, the winner of the second edition of the Global Challenges Talent Award promoted by CDOP and Bank Sabadell Foundation as part of their Global Talent Program, which aims to promote quality research by young researchers. My name is Ines Arco. I was the winner of the first edition of the Talent Global Junior Visiting Fellowship last year, and I am currently a researcher at CDOP focusing on East Asia and China. So welcome, Erin, and congratulations on the award.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to talk to you today.
So as a short presentation, Erin Parsons is a Fulbright grantee in Nuuk, Greenland, and a fellow in the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network, where she focuses on strategic narrative, telecommunications, and security in the Arctic. She has a research master's in international studies from eBay and a bachelor's in Chinese and international affairs from the University of Oregon. She has previously contributed to CDOP's work with an article on Chinese discourse and narrative towards Xinjiang that was published on the 2020 edition of CDOP's yearbook. So thank you so much, Erin, for accepting the invitation to be here today. It's a pleasure to discuss your article, Relations on Thin Ice, Narrative Analysis of Chinese Governance in the Arctic. And just as a small presentation on her topic, as Erin says, the Arctic is a place of global intrigue. And we have seen that recently, in the last 5 years or so, China is trying to change its position in the region by trying to legitimate itself as a near Arctic state and becoming an active stakeholder in the Arctic affairs. So in your article, you start by pointing out how different dynamics such as climate change, connectivity, energy scarcity are not only turning the Arctic into a key region for the future of the international community, but also how it's increasingly becoming a region of political and geoeconomic competition. So we have seen new actors who apparently are not extremely related to the Arctic, who are becoming really active in the region. For example, becoming observers in the Arctic Council, new partners in business opportunities, and also conducting scientific research projects with states in the region. And some of those new actors are China, India, and Japan, for example. So my question is, has the exceptionalism of the region, which has been defined by peaceful cooperation, has it changed? Has it disappeared? What are your takes on the impact of newcomers, including China, in the region?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I would say in general, no, the region has not changed much. It has still been defined by peaceful cooperation, and I do think we can still consider it exceptional now. Much of the research that I do is really thinking about the future and the challenges that I think are really risky in the Arctic. Right now it still remains peaceful. Just recently there was a peaceful negotiation to a dispute between Canada and Denmark. And so a lot of people sort of celebrated that as an example of the peaceful cooperation that sort of defines the Arctic right now. But what I am really concerned about and what I really think about is how to manage the military and security concerns in the region without an institution whose mandate is directly to respond to those things. And the Arctic Council explicitly does not manage those issues. So sort of thinking about the future, how can we mitigate the emerging risks that are going to be happening in the Arctic, and thinking about the ice melting, thinking about a shifting landscape, more conflictive governance claims, and actually more activity in the region. I think there's a high risk of conflict and of not having sort of the right institution to deal with those issues. I do think every country has a right to care about the Arctic. The Arctic impacts everyone, and thinking about climate change and environmental protection, I think every country should have an Arctic policy. I think every country should have a policy for every region in the world. So I think overall it's great to see more involvement, and I think that having more attention from the global community on the Arctic is important. And I think that's especially true given the commercial shifts that I think we're about to see with the Northern Passage. Trade routes are going to change. This is going to impact the entire world, and so it's relevant to everyone. So overall, I think it's positive. There should be more multilateralism done through the Arctic Council. The thing is that having an Arctic policy is one thing. Trying to establish some kind of legitimacy in the region is something else. And I think that's when we come to the issue with China and the Arctic. China has historically been really critical of US bases and physical presence around the world. And now we're sort of seeing that happen in the Arctic. And I do sort of see them claiming themselves as a legitimate governing actor in the region based on a historical relationship with the region, based on their role as a global power in competition with the US and Russia, who both have a presence in the region. And we do see a discourse showing a dissatisfaction with governance of the Arctic. And so ultimately, I think the problem is not new actors coming into the Arctic Council. I think that's great, having more observer status, but ultimately seeing China as sort of a revisionist actor, which I think we'll discuss a bit later, is really the problem when it comes to China's involvement in the Arctic.
That's definitely super interesting, and would love to hear more about it. And I think that in your article, you actually mentioned something about this change on the discourse that China is doing. No, so you go and you analyze more than 200 sources, including those in Chinese, and you mentioned that there's like a difference between the narrative that are directed towards like national audiences and international ones. No, so we see that China is really trying to portray or to discuss more security and military affairs in the Arctic when speaking to other Chinese people, and using more references towards climate change and scientific research in English. So we see here that China is kind of having two different discourses. And now the question is, what about practices? I mean, there's not always this type of equivalence between discourse and practices. So what has been China's actions in the region, and which narrative would really show or be more in line with those practices?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I take the stance that China's external discourse and their practice do not align. Of course, I do take a constructivist approach to this. I do see discourse as an important way to securitize policy and an important way to formate new policy. But I also see discourse as a helpful hint for future strategy. China's external discourse, so what they're saying to the United Nations, for example, has really remained focused on scientific engagement and this idea of a common heritage, or the idea that the Arctic belongs to everyone. They really take an internationalist approach to the Arctic, which can be threatening to regional actors. This is a little bit different than their internal discourse. Their internal discourse is very anti-US. The anti-US aspect is not so different than their discourse on other issues or other regions. But they also sort of go for a strong Sino-Russian ties discourse on the Arctic. And I think that's really important and really different than some of the external discourse that they're showing. their internal discourse also focuses a lot on sustainable development in the region. And I think that's a very interesting concept because it sort of sounds innocent, but what it's really talking about is the Belt Road Initiative and the Polar Silk Road, which is the Arctic version of the Belt Road Initiative. And, you know, the international community has seen issues all over the world. The European Union has seen issues with countries having too high of trade reliance on China after participating in the Belt Road Initiative and then having less power. So, you know, the internal discourse sort of hints more at that, but ultimately the policy is more aggressive than either of the discourses. China now has one of the largest Arctic fleets on Earth. It's better than Canada's, I believe. They have such high maritime power, which is so relevant for the Arctic. And I also think that their Arctic policy is, you know, it can't be separated from its other policies, from its maritime policy and its space policy. So looking at things like having a really high Arctic surveillance, for example, China now has a satellite that can monitor the Arctic. In my opinion, this type of policy has probably far more to do with great power competition than with monitoring the movement of animals, for example. And they also have, you know, this policy of digital connectivity and telecommunications through the Polar Silk Road. And I think that these can be seen as more threatening than generous when looking at the policy versus the discourse. And then finally, they're just establishing more of a physical presence. And some of this physical presence, which they say is for scientific research, is actually in facilities that could be considered dual use and could be used also for military presence. So even though I think the internal narrative is more aligned with the policy that China takes, regardless, I think the policy is more aggressive than justified by what they're saying to the international community or to their domestic community either.
So, I mean, with this logic of great power competition, we have seen that there's those increasing tensions and even the emergence of a discussion about what's China's interests, like what does China wants to do with international liberal order, right? And the Arctic may be one of those parts where we can see what's China's position and goals toward the current global governance architecture, no? Right? Mm-hmm. So here there's like so many discussions going on. There's people who says China wants a Sinocentric order. There are others that now are currently talking about this new Cold War where we are going towards a bloc confrontation, especially after the war in Ukraine. So what do you believe that it's China's approach in the Arctic? You have mentioned that it's more like reformist. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think sort of first I'll sort of speak to the global order in general, and then I can talk about the Arctic because I think they're both sort of working together. I don't really see China as seeing a need to push for a new global order at the current moment. I think the United States is doing a lot on its own to recede as a global leader and just focusing so much on domestic issues that I do think in the future, we're probably going to see some kind of power vacuum. And it's interesting to see what China may ultimately do when faced with that. But first, of course, I think they need more confidence to take over and to have a stronger opinion in the international community. And I think even though they do a lot of strong multilateral participation in a lot of forums, they also have to navigate like not being a democratic actor and not being a liberal actor. And so I do see China as being revisionist in the Arctic and elsewhere. But I think it's done through a really long game approach, where they're taking really small steps that are sometimes barely even noticeable to the international community. And there are expressions of dissatisfaction of the governance architecture in the Arctic that does sometimes sort of overlap with Russia's discourse. And I do think they sort of co-opt each other. However, I am also of the opinion that China and Russia, though they both benefit right now from sort of sharing this anti-liberal, anti-Western discourse in the Arctic, their relationship is kind of tentative at best. And I don't ultimately see them working together in some sort of Sino-Russian international order goal. I think this is especially true when you're looking at the Arctic, because I don't think Russia has much incentive to change the dynamics of the Arctic at all. They really benefit from being in the Arctic Council, and they really need to develop their Arctic much more before they could change any kind of dynamic. Whereas I think that China doesn't have much reason to keep the status quo in the Arctic for the time being. And so I do see them sort of having separate ultimate goals in the Arctic. I mean, Russia has a huge Arctic presence that they need to manage domestically, and China does not. Ultimately, though, I think the Arctic can really be seen as a gauge for great power competition and a gauge for national identity. And so looking at what's happening in the Arctic is a really interesting way of seeing what China's concerns and worries are on a global scale and in terms of great power competition with the United States. And so we may see sooner in the Arctic the kind of revisionist nature that I predict, but ultimately elsewhere too.
And like this is super interesting, especially on the way that if we can see those small changes already happening, we can predict, or we try to predict, because sometimes it's really difficult to see what's going to happen next, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that, for example, when Xi Jinping became the president of China, there was so much discourse about he changing the previous approach. So Deng Xiaoping's doctrine of hiding its capabilities and biding its time. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that actually what we are seeing is that it may not has changed as much as we thought. I mean, China is getting more ambitious maybe in the international affairs, but they still keep this low profile, and they are being really cautious on how they conduct diplomacy in some areas, not in others. We have seen this wolf warrior diplomacy going on with the COVID, but they still go on a really cautious approach. And that's something that you also mentioned in your article. So if China is biding for its time, mm-hmm. what would be the China's Arctic strategy when this time has come? What elements do we need to focus on and to monitor of China's policy in the Arctic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I certainly see China's approach to the Arctic and to global affairs in general as a long game approach. And I think sometimes this approach can look like biding their time, but in reality is sort of China taking really small micro steps towards a larger goal. And I think especially in the Arctic, it can seem like they're really biding their time. I think in the Arctic specifically, China has less or no claim to legitimacy, and especially in a region that sort of works with the Arctic Council, where you just have the Arctic states that can participate. You know, they have to move slowly so that they don't make Arctic countries nervous, because otherwise, what is their role in the Arctic right now? we've already seen a sudden increase in interest in the Arctic as of 2018. And so sometimes I wonder if biding their time is actually sort of this period of information gathering. There's been a huge increase in academic research and research projects coming out of China. And so I do think gathering information, having the presence to get that information and research might be kind of the biding their time that's happening right now. And that what we're going to see is just a sudden uptick in bilateral foreign direct investment, the buying of land, investing in private capital and joint projects. That's what I see as being the next step. And I think once China has a strong position in the private sector, then they can start contributing to governance claims in the Arctic. So I do fear systematic debt trap diplomacy. I know other people might disagree with me. I also sort of fear disinformation campaigns, especially in rural Arctic areas on behalf of China. But ultimately, I think the Arctic strategy is going to be one that's based around energy and telecommunications, and that is going to operate through the private sector primarily. And that all of this is going to be basically backboned by a universalist approach to the Arctic, and this idea of having legitimacy through physical presence and through investments that they have made in the area.
And as someone who has actually lived in Greenland, so one of the key actors in the region, and maybe one in a really special position because now it's increasingly trying to have a bigger autonomy from Denmark. How is the island responding to, for example, Chinese Arctic discourses? And how is this related also to the debt trap diplomacy that you are mentioning?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that was something I was so interested in learning about when I first went to Greenland last year. I really wanted to know what local population, what Greenlandic people thought about Chinese Arctic policy, foreign direct investment, and greater involvement in trade and governance. There was a survey that was done a couple of years ago by a professor at the University of Greenland. And Greenlanders were basically polled on their opinions about great power competition. And they actually polled as being more positive or having more positive feelings towards China than the United States. I'm not sure if, I think this has less to do with actual policy opinion than with the controversy of Trump offering to buy the island in 2019. And sort of a perceived threat of US influence in the region. But overall, even though people have polled kind of positively towards China, they're really trepidatious about any kind of foreign direct investment at all, even though I think people are aware that it's a very necessary move towards becoming independent. What really surprised me in Greenland was that most people do not see independence as sort of any time in the immediate term. A lot of people see independence as only able to happen kind of pretty far in the future. And also so many people are not for independence at all, which surprised me. I think people see their current position, their relationship with the European Union, for example, as more flexible than actually becoming independent and having to deal with creating alliances and that sort of thing. And so there is a push for greater involvement with Denmark. I mean, when I was there, there's even discussions about changing the time zone so that they could actually be closer to Danish time, which I thought was really interesting, being that they're a North American piece of land. But there is a leftist movement that's against mining and extraction, but I think people are not sure what alternatives they might have to become a stronger presence in the region. I still think that Greenland has a lot to manage domestically, and that they remain pretty isolated from the rest of the world. So I'm not sure there's really a clear plan, but I do know that there is fear about receiving investment from foreign countries in general.
That's really, really interesting. And I think that's also something that here in Europe, it's not something that we are used to hear about. So I really thank you for giving us a little glimpse on Greenland's perspective. And now, just as a conclusion, maybe, I would like to ask you, like, what do you think that the international community, for example, the European Union or NATO, we should closely monitor of China's strategy in the Arctic? What are you have mentioned so many challenges. So now it's like, what do we need to do? I mean, it doesn't have to be like specific policies, but just what would you encourage, or what are going to be your future work on the issue?
Yeah, it's a big question, but I think it will be really important, that the West, so to say, NATO, European Union, really look into the private sector. I mean, I talk a lot about geoeconomics in the research that I did, and I think really monitoring bilateral ties, bilateral investments, and foreign direct investment from China into Arctic nations is really important. I think any kind of research that can sort of map private company actors, map university relationships and joint projects can all be really interesting to understanding what China's goals are in the region. But I certainly think we should focus on the private sector and sort of how China sort of gains a foothold through the private sector, and then also through a physical presence through joint projects and that sort of thing. Especially for NATO, I think NATO needs to have a more clear mandate towards the Arctic. And I don't think it's really understood exactly what NATO is supposed to do in that region. But having sort of more maritime presence is going to be really important in the Arctic. And then, of course, I think there needs to be more done on the security forum that could exist in the Arctic, where nations can actually manage their disputes and discussions in a more clear way, multilaterally. And finally, I think this is something that my research did not focus on, but it's incredibly important. So I feel I have to bring it up. But really, the Arctic has a lot of human security issues. There's problems with health, alcoholism, violence, and suicide. And I think when we're looking at the Arctic, developing it and dealing with these sort of human security concerns is going to be really important for allowing Arctic peoples to be involved in the international community and have a say for what's happening in the Arctic in the future.
Thank you so much. Like when you were saying all those things, like climate change, I think it's a big word that we have to keep all in mind. And also like how we really can protect even indigenous people's rights in the region. And you also were talking about. I would love to ask you so many other questions, and I would love to do it like the next time in person, but I think that we have to conclude it here. It was a pleasure having you. I learned a lot about the Arctic and all those new dynamics that are going on. So I really have to thank you for your research, and I hope to see you soon and continue reading your works on the region. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you today.